Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me this morning. I'm really sad that I can't see you all in person. I think that this conference was literally the last thing that I went to last year before everything shut down. So while I'm incredibly honored and excited to be a part of this event, I am very sad that I can't see everybody in person. But I'm here to talk to you today about the wild, wild west of the Internet of Things. And I was really excited to be approached about this topic because I think it's very meaningful and there are a lot of nuances to this discussion that people may not have considered. So when we talk about the Internet of Things and IoT, um, IoT is a term that is becoming less meaningful as time goes by because now everything is a computer and computers can be hacked. Therefore, everything can be hacked. Your phone is a computer, and we look at these smartphones the first thing in the morning and the last thing before we go to bed. The industrial control systems that give us the energy we need for every single aspect of our lives, those are all driven by intelligent and smart devices and sensors that are all part of the Internet of Things. The manufacturing facilities that produce the goods that we touch every single day, this is all part of the Internet of Things, and all of it is vulnerable. Every single aspect of our personal lives as well is touched by smart devices. As we start bringing appliances and doorbells and pet feeders and light bulbs and smart toothbrushes into our homes, we're bringing in all of this sometimes dodgy, certainly vulnerable technology into our lives on every single personal level as well, even when it's perhaps not advisable. This is a smart diaper. It is something you attach onto your baby's diaper, and it has a humidity sensor and sends an alert to your phone that lets you know that your baby needs a diaper change. And as someone who is a parent, but also a cybersecurity professional, I can say that this is a terrible idea for at least three or four different reasons. So, why are we doing this? And what are the risks inherent in embracing the Internet of Things? At IBM Security X Force, we monitor the dark web and we monitor security alerts around the world. We have we have tens of thousands of people employed in cybersecurity roles around the world. And part of what we do is security research and dark web monitoring. And since 2018, we have seen a 3,000% increase in Internet of Things and industrial control systems attacks. That's not a typo, a 3,000% increase. We report on these findings every year in the IBM X-Force Threat Intelligence Index, which we just released for 2021. And the numbers are certainly frightening. And it begs the question, why is this happening? And how are these systems vulnerable? So if I were to break it down, I would say that the Internet of Things is vulnerable for three key reasons. And at the heart of this, I talk about both the Internet of Things and industrial control systems as, sort of the two different facets of the same problem. The first is the sheer complexity of this space. You're talking about a massive ecosystem of very diverse devices and things and a very complex supply chain. With not a lot of interoperability between the different types of devices and the different vendors that are out there. In the Internet of Things supply chain, we have our vendors, we have our integrators, we have our operators, and then we have our consumers. So it's really complicated to manage any kind of visibility or security or interoperability across that supply chain. Secondly, if there's one thing that we know from IT security, it's that even when we can and should patch, we don't. And in the 8 of the top 10 vulnerabilities that we studied in 2020 were at least a year old. So even when we can and should patch software, we don't. It gets even more complicated when you're looking at devices and components, some of which are not even designed to be patchable. The infamous Mirai botnet of 2016, which took down the entire internet for about a day or so, that happened because of DVRs that could not be patched. So we have these components and these devices that you can't even secure that are out there. And that's a huge problem in IoT. And finally, the indiscernibility of that security telemetry is also a huge problem. It's really difficult to get that combined IT and OT point of view. It's hard enough in IT security. And when you start adding in alerts of the variety and the speed and volume, when you start adding in, water sensors and traffic lights and manufacturing devices, it becomes a huge problem for overall visibility. And that lack of discernibility and the importance of that in security is something that I want to talk about a little bit longer, because I think it's really important, not just for IoT, but for cybersecurity in general. And to do that, I have a story to tell. So several years ago, back when we could do these things, my husband and I went to go see the comedian Dave Chappelle perform at Place des Arts in Montreal, where we live. And about 2/3 of the way through the show, a fight breaks out. Literal fight. 2 guys, fisticuffs, right down in front of the stage, shirt pulled over the head, body blows, the whole bit. It's a full-on brawl at frickin' Place des Arts. Security comes in, they separate the 2 combatants, and as they're being dragged off, the security guard has the one guy in the full Nelson, and Dave Chappelle squats down at the front of the stage and looks the guy dead in the eye, and he says, "Sir, you have made bad choices this evening." And the 2 guys are dragged out. It takes a while for the crowd to settle. And so Dave Chappelle says, "Okay, never mind what I was going to talk about before. We're going to talk about this. We got to talk about this." And what I want to know is, what was the last thing said before the first punch was thrown? And that tells me right there that Dave Chappelle could be a security analyst. That's what he wants to know in that moment. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of questions. I had a ton of questions. Who are these guys even? Is there beer on the floor? Where are their girlfriends? What's going on? Do they know each other? Do they not know each other? Where were they sitting? What's going to happen to the show? Are we going to run late? None of that really matters in that precise moment, except for what was the last thing said before the first punch was thrown. And that's a critical thing in cybersecurity, to be able to discern that penultimate event and then build your narrative out from there. And to do that in security, it's not just about monitoring and visibility. It is about discernment. It's about being able to narrow down with pinpoint accuracy, what is that thing and where does my narrative build out from there? And part of that is having the right tools. Part of that is investing in the right security strategy and the right security platform. Part of that is the tradecraft inherent in being an analyst and not falling into the trap of building your own narrative without confirmation. And you can't do that unless you're able to pinpoint that penultimate event and get confirmation that what you look at is what you think you're looking at, and then do the analysis. That's incredibly hard to do in an IT security environment when you have a massive amounts of data that's coming at rapid speed. And if you're being attacked, then bad things are happening and bad things are evolving. So it's an ever-changing situation. It gets even worse when you're trying to add in the IoT aspect to it, and you have all of that other data coming in at ferocious speed and volume from your IoT devices without necessarily the ability to discern it and separate and find that needle in the haystack. So this is part of the challenge of IoT security, is because a lot of the attacks that we see are blended IT, OT things that take advantage of vulnerabilities on one or the other or both sides of the house. It's really hard to understand what you're looking at and how you stop it. When we talk about the Internet of Things, there's kind of two broad categories of IoT technology. And the first is industrial IoT. So we're talking about the kinds of devices that we see in manufacturing, right? In transportation, in energy and utilities, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. We talk a lot in this space about OT, operating technology, and about industrial control systems. And these are the systems which have a direct impact on our life and safety, right? It's our water treatment plants, it's our energy plants, it's healthcare devices. So anything that happens around this critical infrastructure, it can be, devastating. If we look at the past history or recent history of industrial IoT cyber attacks, we see that there's on average about one significant attack per year. And some of these get pretty scary. In 2010, there was a malware attack against a nuclear reactor in the Middle East, which failed only because of a bug in the malware. In 2015, a cyber attack brought down a Ukrainian power plant for several days and left 250,000 people in the Ukraine without power in December. In 2017, there was a malware attack against a Saudi chemical plant, which had the potential, if it had caused physical damage to the plant, the injury and the potential loss of human life would have been catastrophic. Something similar happened at the Norsk Hydro aluminum plant in 2019, where cyber criminals brought down the human machine interfaces to control the devices in the plant. And then all of a sudden that they couldn't turn off smelters. They couldn't shut down conveyor belts. And everything was just operating, and they had to intervene with manual overrides in order to prevent, a physical damage and potential injury or loss of life. And as recently as last year, there was a cyber attack against a water treatment plant in the US, where the adversaries were trying to tamper with the amount of chemicals being added to the water. And that gets really bad because not enough chlorine in your water is bad for you, and too much chlorine in your water is also really bad for you. So, we see these things happen, and there's a couple trends that we see there. I mean, one is that a lot of the attacks against industrial IoT don't even necessarily go after the OT, the operating technology, or the industrial control environment. Some of them are just good old-fashioned Windows malware, because like with Norsk Hydro, if you can shut down the computers that control the plant, you've shut down the plant, right? And we're starting, unfortunately, in a lot of these environments. I think this is starting to change, but historically, in a lot of these environments, we've seen a certain amount of complacency as well. A lot of organizations in these industries, will air gap the industrial control environment, but that's not necessarily a defense. The Stuxnet reactor was quite famously air gapped, and they were still attacked. And we're starting to see the rise of ICS-specific malware. So malware that is specifically crafted for those environments, which says a couple of things. First of all, the adversaries are very diligent about their reconnaissance, and they are not above crafting bespoke malware to bring down their target. So, complacency is the killer, and you can't assume that because you're air gapped that you're necessarily safe. You have to assume that somebody's going to find a way in. And when we look at the top targeted industries, we see a fairly disturbing trend in the last year. Between 2019 and 2020, based on sheer volume of attack, we've observed that manufacturing and energy, which in 2019 were in the bottom of the top 10 targeted industries for cyber attacks, in 2020, they moved up to number 2 and number 3. Finance is always number 1. It's a given that financial services is always going to be the number 1 attacked industry because that's where all the money is. But manufacturing and energy moved up to number 2 and number 3. And in my opinion, there's a couple reasons for that. I mean, you have to remember that at the end of the day, most cyber criminals are after money. So they're going to go where the money is. And in these kinds of environments, in manufacturing and energy in particular, there's very little tolerance for downtime. The restart cycles on some of these facilities and some of these systems can be 8, 12, 16, 20, 24 hours. And you just can't afford that downtime. So if you can shut somebody down, there's probably a greater chance that you can pressure them into paying the ransom. And that's kind of borne out by the trend that we see in the attack types that are leveraged against operating technology environments, with ransomware being far and away the most common attack against OT type organizations. Um, there's a famous ransomware attack, the big ransomware attack of last year. Uh, they targeted manufacturing more than any other single industry. Conservative estimates put the losses to this malware attack at somewhere around $123 million globally. And that's a conservative estimate, and it's still growing. The disturbing thing is that about 2/3 of the people attacked by that paid the ransom. And then about 43% of them had their data leaked anyway. So that's a new trend that we're seeing in ransomware. It's what we call double extortion, that not only will the adversaries hit you with ransomware and shut you down, it should be accepted that everyone's got backups right now. So, maybe you'll say, that's fine. I don't have to pay the ransom. I've got a backup to go to, but then they'll threaten to leak your confidential data. So that's the double extortion trend that we're now seeing with ransomware attacks. And again, the ReEvil ransomware attack of last year targeted manufacturing more than any other industry. And what is this piece of ransomware? It comes back to good old-fashioned IT security. So we're seeing, typical IT type malware attacks being leveraged against these industries and these environments, despite the fact that they have all these other IoT devices. And so it all comes down to good old fashioned, IT security best practices, awareness, and hygiene. We know that cybercrime is a business. So, like any other business, cyber criminals will seek innovation. They will follow opportunity. They will go where the money is. And unfortunately, our adversaries are very, very much on trend, because we have predictably seen attacks related to COVID, specifically attacks in and related to the healthcare and logistics sectors. So, for example, there's been the predictable uptick of COVID themed spam and phishing. We have seen hospitals and healthcare organizations in the last year targeted by ransomware. Most famously, a case in Germany that did involve a patient death because they weren't able to admit the patients to the hospital. We've seen attacks leveraged at the PPE supply chain in Germany. And in October, IBM X-Force uncovered an attack against the vaccine cold chain. The cold chain is the systems that ensure the preservation of vaccines during storage and transportation. So we've seen definite reconnaissance around this area where cyber criminals are trying to get insight into that supply chain, presumably, to leverage some kind of test of capability or some kind of disruption or attack against, that part of our critical infrastructure. Just last week, it was reported that Chinese APT has been targeting Indian vaccine manufacturers. So this is all very much on trend. And some of this is, relates directly to our IoT environments. And some of this is just good old fashioned cyber hacks against parts of our critical infrastructure. The other broad category of IoT technology is consumer IoT. So this is where we're talking about, all the stuff that we buy off Amazon or Best Buy or whatever, to try and make our lives a little easier and a little more convenient right now. These are smart homes, our wearable devices, all the different wellness devices out there. And all you have to do is go ahead and Google the IoT Hall of Shame, and you will see endless cases of digital home assistants, cameras, automatic pet feeders, even children's toys being attacked and being compromised by cyber criminals. One of the most infamous consumer IoT-based hacks was the Mirai botnet in 2016 that leveraged vulnerabilities in devices like DVRs and cameras to bring down the internet. There were a couple days there where there was no Twitter, there was no Netflix, all of that was gone, and that was because of the Mirai botnet. Shortly after that attack, researchers at the SANS Institute took a very common brand of DVR and set it up on the internet with the default password. And then they just sat back and they watched while this thing got randomly accessed by unknown people using that default password every 2 minutes. Every 2 minutes. So here's a pro tip for you. Don't ever keep the default password on anything that you bring in your home. We're seeing automation in cybercrime where a lot of this is being done with scripts and bots, and it doesn't even have a person at the end of the keys to do that scan and to see what's out there, what can I get access to, what if people left wide open as an open door or window into their home network. So why do we do this? Why do we bring all of this stuff into our homes and make ourselves, as individual consumers, so vulnerable? Well, consumer IoT use cases kind of boil down to these four things, right? I want gadgets that are going to help me find my stuff or monitor my stuff, right? Like home security systems and all those smart home devices. I want gadgets that are going to help me take care of myself, give me information about my heart rate, help me track my medication schedule, things like that. And I also want gadgets that are just going to do stuff for me. One of the most fascinating things about IoT is that it's extended the capability of remote control beyond what Bluetooth and Wi-Fi can do. So, my car, for example, doesn't even have to be anywhere near my house in order for me to control it. When there was flooding in the southern United States, we saw that Tesla was able to push out software updates to their cars that would give people, would optimize the drive transmission or the drivetrain or whatever, so that they would be able to travel longer and prolong the battery life. On the one hand, like, it's kind of amazing that you're able to nimbly do that in the face of a natural disaster to meet a very human need to get to safety. On the other hand, part of me is also kind of angry because it's like, well, if you could do that, why would you not just give me longer battery life to begin with? But that's a whole other conversation. But these consumer IoT cases, there's obviously a huge overlap between these consumer use cases and the industrial use cases. Asset tracking, absolutely applicable in an industrial environment. Security and environmental monitoring that we have with our smart home devices, 100% applicable in an industrial environment as well. Health monitoring. You could use these devices to monitor the biometrics of your employees out in the field or out in facilities, right? And the remote control case as well, right? We're looking at increased automation as a core part of the new industrial revolution. So remote control of devices using IoT is really important. And, for us as consumers, it all comes down to that trade-off between convenience and security. About 2 years ago, my husband and I were embarking on a little renovation of our TV room, and he wanted accent lighting put in. So we got these really fancy, like, multicolored lights you can put up behind the TV, and he wanted to be able to, like, change the colors. And this may or may not be something that I've set up, for like private dance party for one, now that we can't go anywhere and do anything. We got this fancy accent lighting. And when he was installing it, my husband comes to me one day and he says, "Hey, you work in cybersecurity." And I said, "Why? Thank you for noticing. What's your question?" And he said, "So these lights were controlled by an app on your phone that connects to the little control panel on the wall with Bluetooth. But in order to enable the app, you had to create an account on the vendor's website, and you had to provide your email address as well as the name of your home Wi-Fi network. They were asking for the SSID of your Wi-Fi network. And he said, so this is not good, right? And my response, I believe, was burn it, burn it, burn it with fire. So that was an immediate return, an immediate Amazon return. And we now have a different system that does not do this. But there doesn't even have to be any deliberate malfeasance there. I mean, this could just very simply be a case of the people who developed this technology not really thinking through how it could or should be deployed or enabled, right, for the end consumer. So there doesn't even have to be malicious intent there for it to be a terrible idea from a security point of view. And this is kind of the problem that we see right now, in that there's this tension between public and private interests. It's one thing to have this amazing, cool, enabling technology. It's another thing entirely to bear in mind all of the security concerns that are going to come into play when this gets out into a consumer environment. And, the least of which is privacy. We're at a point right now, and I like to think that we're really at an inflection point where this is starting to change, where consumer privacy has become an obligation. It started with GDPR, and it's all going in that direction as different jurisdictions bring in their own form of privacy legislation. It is still, of course, really messy, but it's really important. These smart devices know when and where we sleep. They know what we eat. They have our health data. You want a smart mattress or a smart pillow that's going to help you, analyze your sleep patterns and get better sleep. Well, they also have information, about your health data, which is protected and is private right now. Your smart cars, all cars are full of computers now, and self-driving cars are going to be, yet another leap in this direction. But your cars have information about your driving habits that you probably may not want released to, I don't know, your insurance company or to law enforcement without your consent, right? And that idea of what's protected now has been shifting dramatically within the last several years. In some jurisdictions, information like your educational records, your political affiliations, your gender orientation, any information about your sex life is considered private in some jurisdictions, but not in others. And it's really difficult and it's really messy. And part of the problem is that for even the most well-intentioned of corporations, this is really difficult to operationalize. Some big tech companies are better than others on this, and I'm not going to name anybody by name, but even with the best of intentions, operationalizing consumer privacy is a real challenge. And it's one thing it doesn't really matter actually whether you're a large global tech company or you're, a small scrappy startup in Southern Ontario. You have the same problems about understanding that privacy landscape, understanding where your obligations are, and then being able to operationalize it. It's incredibly challenging. But what we're really seeing here is that there is that gap between the public and private interests, because obviously, people who innovate and who invent want to get that technology out there. But how can you do that within the realm of public interest? And this brings me to my next point, which is that smart diaper that we were making fun of about 28 minutes ago actually has a really meaningful application. That is a piece of technology that we should be using in hospitals and in nursing homes, because there, it could prevent things like bed sores and infections in bedridden patients. And yet this is not where we're seeing this. We're seeing this thing being marketed in the consumer market to, bougie first-time parents, I presume. I don't really know. So, there's that gap between what IoT can get you and then how it's being developed and how it's being enabled. And obviously, just for the smart diaper alone, there's a number of regulatory and financial hurdles that would have to be dealt with in order to get that technology into healthcare. But the fact remains that the easiest route to market, and it's meaningful that it's called a route to market, right, for a lot of tech innovators, is that consumer route, where we have different notions, perhaps, of safety and security and privacy than you might in the highly regulated industrial side. So what does all of this mean? Obviously, there's a meeting or a reconciliation that we have to see between public and private interests. And what that brings us to is that need for a 21st century responsibility model. What should our public-private partnerships look like in the 21st century? Because it's very, very clear that security and privacy have to be a public-private partnership. It can't be a bottom-up approach that's driven purely by industry and by private interests, nor can it be something that's solely top-heavy and top-down from government and regulators. And I firmly believe that we're at an inflection point right now where we're starting to see the right things happen. We're starting to see both government and industry step up and accept responsibility. It's messy and it's complicated, but things like mandatory breach notifications are going to help all of us in the long run. Things like the UN mandates around cybersecurity in automotive manufacturing. This is going to help us in the long run. We're close to getting the Canadian Digital Charter passed, and this is a really important step into the 21st century for all of us. We have a long way to go. We're 20 years into the 21st century, and so far it's kind of been a hot mess in this area, but I believe that we're getting there. So what can we do? What should we be asking for, and what should we be looking for in this realm of IoT security? How do we tame the wild, wild west? One thing that we need is we have to ask for security by design. Operating technology and industrial control systems have to be secure by design, not just by default. We're starting to see shifts in the networking world where more responsibility for security and for privacy is starting to be pushed down to the carriers, who in the IoT side would be like the operators. And that doesn't work as well on the IoT side. You really kind of have to start looking at the vendors. So we're, things like a move towards better industry standards for interoperability between IoT devices is really, really critical. Also, the fact that vendors are now increasingly being required to support the IoT devices that they put out there, that's really important. And that's going to help us on the consumer side as well. It used to be that if you bought a router or a DVR or, any kind of whatever consumer electronics, at some point, your vendor would kind of arbitrarily decide that they're not releasing software patches for it anymore, if these things were even patchable in the first place. And it's because the price point of these things has dropped where, eventually they're losing money by continuing to support them. And maybe vendors would just kind of prefer that you go out and buy a new router instead of trying to, continually maintain and upgrade the one that you bought 7 years ago. So now vendors are required to support IoT devices for a period of time, and they can't just arbitrarily decide that they're not going to do it or that they're going to start charging people for that support. So that's a really important and a very, very helpful shift in the consumer IoT market as well. You also, as we start looking at what the workplace is going to look like in the months and years to come, remote work is here to stay. And remote work has been a nightmare for shadow IT. And as we see people making the drive towards faster digital transformation, whether it's more automation or bigger investment in cloud, or in looking at cognitive and AI as enablers to transform the business, this has become a matter of survival for many organizations. And all of that means increased connectivity and an increased convergence of the industrial and consumer IT realms. You're looking at not just your data now being on people's kitchen tables, but also fundamentally your control points, right, for your industrial systems. So what's happening in the consumer IoT arena and on people's home networks has become a profound interest from a security point of view on how you're going to do any kind of IoT or industrial IoT monitoring as well. So here's a couple of pro tips for you. If you have a home full of smart devices, use a VPN, get a password manager, and set up. Most modern routers and modems these days let you set up a Wi-Fi guest network. So create a separate guest network just for all the things. And then you're starting to introduce like your own little bit of almost micro segmentation on your home network. That's just good security hygiene, and that's a good practice. But this convergence and the increased connectivity has some serious implications for our practice of cybersecurity as well. The convergence of those OT and IT environments means that even before the pandemic, that notion of your perimeter has changed dramatically, both within and without organizations. Even in operating technology environments, like your manufacturing plants and your energy plants and whatnot, there's a chance that you could be running a mail server or a web server in that environment. So you've got IT devices within your OT environment. And this means that you have to be more stringent about your security prevention, monitoring, and your orchestration across the enterprise because of that added complexity. So for example, your IT security policies should be extended into your operating technology environment. Things like refuse new network connections. Don't accept any new network connections by default. We've seen cases of rig workers in remote areas attaching 4G modems onto those towers because that makes it more convenient to connect and get the readings. You don't actually have to climb a tower, but that broadens your attack surface. That's opening it up to the internet, and that's introducing a vulnerability. Deny removable media everywhere in your OT environments. Like these are basic IT security policies that should be extended into that operating technology environment. At the same time, you also have to monitor and keep an accurate inventory of the IT networking devices that are in your OT environment, and make sure by conversely that you're sending and correlating all of those OT events into your IT security platform. IT security tools have given us the ability to analyze, to correlate, to detect and alert and so on. Right now, not a lot of them are really great at, none of them really are great at natively accepting OT telemetry, but that's not to say that you can't do that. It takes some effort, and there's some constant care and feeding involved, but you have to be, you have to run this converged security operations center where you are monitoring the IT assets in your OT environment, and you're also sending those OT events to your IT security platform. It's got to be on both sides. And then concordant with that is the need for better orchestration across the enterprise. Automation begets automation. And as a lot of our critical infrastructure moves to more automation and more devices and more of these things, we're seeing, not surprisingly, automation in cyber attacks. So the only way for us to respond in this kind of cyber arms race is to intelligently use automation in our cyber defense. So, you have to use things like cognitive and AI to augment human capability, and you have to be able to orchestrate across the enterprise and automate those aspects of your security response that you can, so that your people can concentrate on the really difficult things and the challenging things that human analysts need to do. So this is what we mean when we talk about the converged SOC of the 21st century, and that's something that's absolutely critical for IT security. Finally, connectivity is your greatest threat, regardless of who you are. But the great thing about that is that it's completely testable, it's completely reproducible. We know how internet connectivity works. So why are we not testing it? You need to test your devices. Part of everybody's procurement process, if there's IoT devices involved, you should know those vulnerabilities. How can you analyze for patterns of attack if you don't know what the potential vulnerabilities are? Ask for that data from your vendors. If they can't provide it, set up a lab and test it yourself. You have to put MFA, put multi-factor authentication everywhere. Make sure that you're protecting all of your connections to your integrators, to your maintenance and vendor personnel. Protect your crown jewels. Close all of those critical paths in and those doors and windows. You have to assume, because in cybersecurity, there's no such thing as end of job. So you have to assume that at some point you will get a command and control channel. So how quickly can I detect that when that happens, regardless of where it originates from? Can I spot reconnaissance? Can I spot passive scanning? Can I spot lateral movement? Can I spot data exfiltration and privilege escalation? How quickly can I find these things, and how quickly can I shut them down? You have to do both your scanning of your environment as well as continuous unified monitoring across both the IT and the operating technology sides. And in that case, things like adversary simulation, and there are many companies out there. If you don't have the expertise in house, there are many people who can help you do that. Do the ad sim. Understand what these attacks look like and rehearse your response to it. And finally, take backups religiously and test those backups. Those backups also have to be done both on the enterprise side and on the operations side too. So back up and test those backups religiously. We're at a point now where the promise of the Internet of Things, it's not going away. We're here. This is our future. And these devices and the Internet of Things are so fundamental to the necessities of life. And they also unlock the promise of things like, affordable renewable energy and telehealth, and making all of these advances sustainable and achievable for everybody. But to get there, we have a lot of hurdles to pass, both technology-wise and as a society. I believe that we're going to get there. I believe that things are moving in the right direction, and it's going to be a long journey. A lot of these things may seem inconvenient. Some of them are burdensome, but we live in a world that is fueled by the Internet of Things, and we're moving towards a future that's going to be empowered by the Internet of Things. So we'll have to get there, and we'll have to get there together. I think I've lost track of the WebEx chat. If it's, I may not have, there we go. I'm going to see if there's any questions right now. So I see a bunch of questions that people have asked in the chat, and I apologize for not getting to this before. So the first question I see is, what are standard controls that need to be implemented for manufacturers? And there aren't really any. It's kind of, I'm not kidding when I say it's like the wild, wild west out there. There's not a lot of global standards around security for IoT devices, but that's coming. When we think of these industries, like transportation is a really great example of a highly, highly regulated industry when you think about what goes into building or maintaining things like aircraft. But a lot of those standards have historically been focused on safety and performance and not cybersecurity. So, we're getting there now, and it's coming. So the second question I see is, without regulated IoT, how do we know if a product is safe to attach to my network? I could be glib and I could say you don't, but part of this is common sense. Like with my husband and his fancy lights, be aware of privacy risks as a consumer. Educate yourself enough that you can set up your home network with some basic, good practice security things like that separate guest Wi-Fi network for all of the smart devices. If in a commercial setting, ask the vendor for vulnerability information, ask them for that test results, and a lot of them may not have it, but start asking the question and do that testing. The next question I see is, how does the patching cycle or patch management policy different from normal devices connected to the network? There's that varies wildly. I mean, on the software IT side, patch hygiene overall is pretty terrible. You know, we can and should patch. Software vendors put out software patches regularly, and you know, many people are months and even years behind in patching them. It gets even worse on the IoT side. Um, so how is it different? I think it's different in that because a lot of IoT devices, you know, aren't patchable right now, you can't patch what you can't patch. So let's just not worry about it. But that's obviously not an answer. You know, patching and good patching hygiene, it's not a complicated thing to do. It's just not easy, right? It's simple, but it's not easy. You have to understand vulnerabilities. You have to understand criticality of resources. You have to prioritize, and you have to, you know, build a patch strategy around that that suits your organization. That's difficult to do. And the next question I see is, could you comment on security issues facing human-machine interfaces? In a lot of industrial environments, the human-machine interface is a Windows terminal, right? Which hopefully is not running Windows 95, but in some cases might be. It's a real exposure in a lot of industrial environments that those HMIs are not always maintained or secured with the same rigor that your enterprise workstations in your corporate environment might be. So when I talk about, you know, extending your IT security policies onto the operating technology and the industrial control system side, that's absolutely critical. If the Windows patches have to go out to HR and finance, they have to go out to your HMIs as well. And that's a huge gap that we see in a lot of organizations, and the need for convergence, because whether you like it or not, your networks and your devices and your attack surface has converged, and you know, your security and your security posture and your security defenses have to converge as well. The last question that I see here in the chat is, in the light of the Florida water supply attack, what are your perspectives? I'm not surprised. You know, when I see the attacks that are happening on the industrial side and some of the things that happen, you know, particularly a lot of the COVID themed ones, I'm not surprised at all when any of these things happen anymore. It doesn't take much to fall down the rabbit hole of understanding just how vulnerable a lot of our systems are. And what we see a lot is that the adversaries will do things more as a test of capability than an actual attack. There's a real difference between the financially motivated cybercrime organizations as opposed to the state-sponsored, like the nation-state attackers. You know, they've obviously got different agendas and different motivations. But one thing that we do see is a lot of things will happen as a test of capability, just enough to understand that, hey, I could bring this system down. I could mess with the water supply, and now I know how to do it, and I'll save that for when I have a good reason to, you know, whatever that reason might be. A lot of what we see in this side, you know, looks like tests of capability rather than outright attacks. And that doesn't necessarily make any of us who work in this industry sleep better at night. It also gets a little disturbing when we look at some recent attacks. You know, SolarWinds is a very good example, because that's an attack that worked because they targeted the software supply chain. And it's exposed some vulnerabilities in our basic networking infrastructure, like globally. That's a huge problem. So, you know, obviously supply chains have to be better examined. But you know, these attacks we see a trend where some of these widespread attacks will leverage servers hosted in countries like the United States, in democracies, Western democracies, because democracies are not super well positioned to defend against these kinds of attacks because we are democratic, because we are free and open, and because we believe in, an open internet and open commerce and an open exchange of ideas and information and all of that. The cyber criminals are smart. The adversary is smart. They will find the path of least resistance to accomplish what they want to do. So, why, if I can, co-opt servers in open and free Western democracies to accomplish my goals, why would I not? It's a lot easier than anything I might do otherwise. Several years ago, we did see an incident where some group in China was able to reroute internet traffic from wherever it was normally supposed to go and route it all through servers in China. And there was no disruption to the internet traffic per se. But what it did was all of that information went through Chinese servers, which means they say they suddenly have visibility into the internet, all the data and all the traffic on the internet for that point of time. And that was something that was very clearly a test of capability to understand, hey, if we wanted to monitor the whole world, could we? And the answer to that was yes. Yes, they could. So that's kind of my perspective on the threat landscape right now. And I don't want to end on a down note. I really do believe that some of the things that we're seeing, like the UN mandates and the privacy legislation, which admittedly it's a hot mess, especially as in the United States at a state level, all the different states are bringing in their privacy regulations. And so, you drive 50 kilometers and you're in a different state and suddenly different privacy rules apply. It's complicated to say the least. But these are necessary building blocks to getting where we need to go. I think that GDPR was huge for establishing privacy as a basic human right. And that notion and making it an obligation, and the things that we're seeing now of it, making it, a legally and financially enforceable obligation are really, really important to protecting us in the future. And ultimately, I'm a technology optimist. I believe in tech. I believe in the democratizing and enabling capabilities and potential of technology. And damn it, when it's safe to do so, I want a robot butler. I really, really do. So I think that we're going to get there. We're at that messy inflection point right now, but these building blocks are starting to come into play. It became clear in the last year that everybody had to up their game in security, and everybody had to become a security professional in some way to navigate through the rapid change of the pandemic. And I think that responsibility is going to be incumbent on all of us as we emerge into a post-pandemic world as well. I don't see any more questions in the chat, and I'm really sorry that I can't see everybody's faces, but I'm really happy to be here today. I'm going to be around. If you have other questions, feel free to message me on the platform or, hit me up on LinkedIn or whatever. And have a great rest of your conference.